The pristine silence of a North Hollywood suburb in June of 1983 was the ultimate American dream. Sprinklers hissed rhythmically across manicured lawns while oblivious neighbors drank black coffee behind white picket fences. This perfect picture of absolute safety remained undisturbed until it was abruptly torn apart by unimaginable violence. The brutally battered body, bleeding out on the polished hallway floor, belonged to a 72-year-old mother named Osa Gordon. What the arriving police officers could never have guessed was that the person gripping a bloody hammer was her own biological son. By the late 1960s, the Los Angeles music machinery was a ruthless capitalist engine running entirely on session musicians. If you turned on a radio anywhere in America, you were essentially listening to the same anonymous room of exhausted professionals. Jim Gordon was the undisputed golden boy of this windowless, performance-driven underworld, where human beings were treated like flesh metronomes. He possessed a terrifying level of mechanical perfection that made him the most requested drummer in the entire state of California. Producers at Gold Star Studios did not just want his rhythm. They wanted his complete submission to the grueling American work ethic. In a city where your worth was strictly measured by your studio output, he was the ultimate infallible rhythmic commodity. But the real secret of his relentless productivity was something far darker than mere professional dedication to the craft of drumming. He was the pounding heartbeat behind the Beach Boys' legendary Pet Sounds and the rhythmic foundation of the Byrds' most iconic records. When George Harrison needed a towering wall of sound for All Things Must Pass, he specifically demanded Jim Gordon behind the kit. He toured endlessly with Joe Cocker, providing the muscular, driving force behind the legendary Mad Dogs and Englishman-American concert circuit. The record label saw him as an indestructible machine, a perfectly calibrated instrument that could be rented for $1,000 a week. He played customized Camco drum kits with a heavy, deliberate precision that anchored the wild, drug-fueled chaos of 1970s rock. You can hear his immaculate timing on Steely Dan tracks, executing complex jazz rock patterns while maintaining the studious calm of an accountant. He was living the ultimate American dream, accumulating immense wealth and industry respect while remaining completely faceless to the general public. That was the pristine public facade, but here is where the narrative takes a sickening turn into the shadows of the human mind. In the sweltering late summer of 1970, the rock world descended upon Criteria Studios in Miami to record a legendary masterpiece. Eric Clapton had assembled Derek and the Dominos to create an album that would become a cornerstone of classic American guitar rock. The studio was a suffocating pressure cooker of unrequited love, massive egos, and mountainous quantities of pharmaceutical-grade illicit substances. Amidst this swirling hurricane of rockstar excess, the drummer remained notoriously quiet, retreating into the background like a dutiful, invisible shadow. While others indulged in the typical hedonism of the era, he isolated himself in empty rooms with an unsettling, deeply terrifying focus. He was meticulously tuning his snare drum for hours, while the fragile fabric of his actual reality was quietly beginning to tear apart. Late one evening, when the studio was mostly empty, the engineers heard an achingly beautiful piano melody drifting through the heavy acoustic doors. Jim Gordon was sitting completely alone at a grand piano, playing a sweeping, mournful progression that sounded like a heartbreaking classical elegy. Clapton was absolutely mesmerized by the sheer emotional weight of the piece, and immediately demanded that they record it for the album. That improvised piano section was spliced onto the end of Layla, creating one of the most famous musical codas in 20th century history. Millions of listeners would eventually close their eyes and let that majestic, soaring instrumental wash over them in moments of profound melancholy. It became the ultimate soundtrack for broken hearts, a beautiful testament to unrequited love broadcast across every FM radio station in America. He had accidentally authored a cultural touchstone that would generate millions of dollars in royalties for a completely indifferent corporate music machine. What none of those deeply captivated listeners could have possibly known was the horrifying, tragic reality behind the creation of that legendary piano outro. The young drummer was not channeling some deep romantic sorrow or composing a brilliant musical tribute to the agonizing, inescapable pain of lost love. He was desperately pounding those heavy ivory keys to drown out the violent, screaming voices that were echoing inside his own fractured skull. The most breathtakingly beautiful melody of the decade was actually the desperate sonic manifestation of a man experiencing a catastrophic, irreversible psychological collapse. He was playing with such overwhelming intensity because the terrifying auditory hallucinations were telling him that his loved ones were trying to kill him. The industry praised his solitary dedication, willfully ignoring the blatant fact that their greatest rhythmic asset was silently fracturing into a million jagged pieces. That haunting piano coda was not a stroke of genius, but rather the very first undeniable death rattle of a profoundly sick human mind. It was the first sliver of light through a door that was about to be nailed shut forever with a hammer and a butcher knife. The early 1970s in American rock music provided the perfect camouflage for a mind slowly fracturing into countless jagged pieces. Jim Gordon was blindly riding the massive success of Layla across colossal stadium stages from New York to sunny Los Angeles. Behind the massive gleaming Ludwig drum kit, his unparalleled rhythmic precision remained absolutely flawless night after grueling night on the road tour. Yet in the suffocating, isolating silence of empty hotel rooms, the phantom voices began whispering their first insidious and cruel commands. He heard them loud and clearly through the relentless hum of the central air conditioning units in those opulent penthouse suites. They sounded exactly like distant, distorted radio static bleeding through an expensive studio monitor speaker during a late-night recording session. The people around him simply assumed he was hearing some complex, brilliant polyrhythmic beat that no one else could possibly comprehend at all. What exactly does a ruthless music industry machinery do when their most lucrative rhythmic genius starts exhibiting severely erratic and dangerous behavior? In the hedonistic epicenter of the American rock era, they simply handed him another strong drink and quickly looked completely away. The sprawling entertainment ecosystem of California was specifically built to protect its most profitable financial assets from any real psychological scrutiny. Managers and wealthy record executives eagerly blamed the mountains of cocaine and endless bottles of cheap whiskey for his bizarre actions. It was remarkably convenient to write off his worsening paranoia as just another predictable rock star struggling with heavy substance abuse. The glittering veil of his immense musical fame provided an impenetrable defensive shield against any legitimate and truly necessary psychiatric intervention. As long as he showed up at the recording studio and laid down those platinum drum tracks, nobody ever asked any difficult questions. His deteriorating psychological condition soon began manifesting in bizarre and undeniably alarming physical actions during massive American concert tours. He started explicitly refusing to eat the lavish catered meals provided backstage, convinced that unknown assassins were deliberately poisoning his food. He would violently barricade himself inside his cramped dressing room, screaming furiously at invisible tormentors who were allegedly conspiring against his life. Fellow musicians merely chuckled nervously, easily dismissing these terrifying psychotic episodes as the eccentric personal quirks of a tortured artistic savant. The relentless touring schedule never paused for a single second to properly address the gaping wounds in his rapidly unraveling sanity. They just pumped him full of heavy tranquilizers and shoved him back onto the brightly lit stage to keep the financial engine running. But here is where it gets truly terrifying for absolutely everyone who naively thought they fully understood the depths of his mental condition. The generalized auditory hallucinations that had violently plagued him for months suddenly crystallized into one distinct and overpowering commanding vocal presence. It was absolutely no longer the vague whispers of nameless enemies plotting his ultimate downfall in the dark corners of quiet recording studios. Instead, the relentless internal noise permanently morphed into the unmistakable and highly authoritative voice of his very own mother, Osa Marie Gordon. This spectral maternal figure living inside his fractured mind began directly dictating his every waking movement with an aggressive level of absolute control. The American music industry continued loudly celebrating his outward musical genius, while remaining blissfully ignorant of the horrifying hostage situation happening within his brain. He was a silent prisoner hopelessly trapped inside his own deteriorating neurological pathways, chained tightly to a drum set while his fractured mind burned. The profound tragedy of the entertainment machine is that it will eagerly applaud a drowning man if his desperate thrashing closely resembles a beautiful dance. To the outside world, Jim Gordon in his late 20s was the walking, breathing embodiment of the ultimate American dream. He was a blonde, handsome Californian, making more money in a single month than most hard-working factory employees saw in a decade. You would consistently find him sitting behind a massive set of custom Ludwig drums at prestigious recording studios across Hollywood, keeping a metronomic beat that held the greatest rock anthems together. He possessed a terrifying level of professionalism that made him the most coveted session musician from the Sunset Strip to New York City. But beneath that polished, sun-kissed exterior, the fragile foundation of his mind was already rotting away from severe, unchecked paranoia. He was silently fighting a brutal war inside his own head while flashing confident smiles for the rolling cameras and demanding press photographers. The American music industry of the early 70s was a ruthless capitalist machine that fundamentally did not tolerate malfunctioning human cogs. Powerful record executives and talent managers in expensive tailored suits clearly saw the erratic behavior, the sudden unpredictable mood swings, and the terrifying 1,000-yard stares. They witnessed him muttering to empty corners of isolation booths and furiously reacting to cruel insults that nobody in the room had actually spoken. Yet, they collectively chose to look the other way, pouring more expensive whiskey, and sliding more narcotics across the mixing console to keep him functioning. The financial stakes were simply too astronomical to pause a multi-million-dollar stadium tour or delay a highly anticipated platinum record release. As long as his hands could hold the wooden sticks and his feet could kick the bass pedals, his crumbling sanity did not matter. But here is where the story takes an even darker turn. The terrifying contrast between his public persona and his private reality finally shattered during a massively publicized national stadium tour. On stage, he remained a portrait of absolute studious calm beneath the blinding theatrical lights. He played complex, flawless rhythms. He bowed to roaring crowds. He smiled at famous bandmates. Then he walked into the shadows. The heavy dressing room door clicked shut. The vicious demons immediately took full control. He abruptly pinned his terrified partner against a cold concrete hallway wall. His eyes went completely black with rage. He threw devastating physical punches without a single word of warning. The physical violence was shockingly sudden. It was clinically cold and precise. It lacked any basic human empathy. He left bruised ribs and shattered luxury suites in his wake across multiple major American cities. The touring crew quietly paid the enormous property damages in untraceable cash. They swept the broken glass under the thick carpets. The corporate concert machine simply refused to stop spinning. The terrifying delusions were no longer just quiet whispers slipping through the cracks of a tired brain after grueling midnight studio sessions. The voices inside his skull began to materialize into distinct, aggressive personalities that demanded his absolute obedience and aggressively isolated him from objective reality. He completely stopped eating the gourmet food provided by catering companies, because the voices firmly convinced him that the record executives were secretly poisoning his meals. He would violently dismantle expensive hotel telephones and television sets in the middle of the night, frantically searching for hidden government surveillance microphones. He firmly believed that an elaborate syndicate of federal agents and jealous rival musicians had formed a shadow coalition specifically designed to destroy his life. The ultimate tragedy was that the powerful people who could have actually forced him into psychiatric care were too busy calculating their percentages of his publishing royalties. What happened next would seal his terrifying fate forever. He was eventually abandoned by the glossy, hyper-commercialized entertainment world that had mercilessly squeezed every ounce of creative genius out of his deteriorating brain. The powerful managers stopped calling his landline, the lucrative studio sessions slowly dried up, and the once glorious rock star was left entirely alone in a dark house. Without the highly structured routine of touring to physically anchor him to reality, the final remaining barriers of his fragile sanity rapidly crumbled into absolute dust. The relentless voices in his head finally won the long psychological war, violently stripping away the last human fragments of the brilliant musician who had once captivated millions. He was no longer the golden boy of the Los Angeles music scene, but a helpless prisoner trapped inside the suffocating walls of his own incurable madness. The terrifying stage was now perfectly set for a catastrophic explosion, and that explosion was going to violently destroy the one person who had genuinely loved him before he ever owned a drumstick. Once the platinum record stopped spinning and the stadium lights dimmed, the American music industry efficiently discarded its broken, malfunctioning machine. Jim Gordon was no longer the legendary session drummer who could effortlessly guarantee a hit record in a high-end Los Angeles studio. He rapidly became a terrifying, unpredictable liability that executives swiftly erased from their elite contact lists and exclusive Hollywood party invitations. In a relentless capitalist culture that strictly equates human worth with continuous financial output, a deteriorating musical genius simply ceases to exist. The ruthless entertainment machinery had thoroughly extracted his rhythmic brilliance and quietly locked the heavy soundproof doors right behind his back. Without the protective financial shield of constant touring, he was brutally thrown into the merciless labyrinth of the American healthcare system. Consistent psychiatric care in the United States was an expensive luxury exclusively reserved for those who could still sign lucrative contracts. Instead of receiving the intensive clinical intervention his rapidly fracturing brain desperately required, he was repeatedly shuffled through an indifferent medical bureaucracy. Overworked physicians simply handed him prescription bottles of ineffective sedatives and sent him back into the terrifying isolation of his empty apartment. Medical professionals consistently dismissed his severe delusions as the completely predictable consequences of excessive substance abuse during his rock and roll glory days. They catastrophically misunderstood that the true monster was not chemical dependency, but a permanent structural collapse happening deep within his cerebral cortex. The most profound horror never arrives wearing a terrifying mask from the unpredictable streets of the outside physical world. It is quietly synthesized inside the darkened, inaccessible corridors of your own biological architecture, born entirely from tragically misfiring neural pathways. The disjointed voices inside his head completely stopped being occasional whispers and transformed into a deafening chorus of pure psychological torture. He began aggressively starving himself because unseen phantom entities convinced him that his everyday groceries were being meticulously poisoned by invisible enemies. The physical walls of his apartment became a horrifying echo chamber where imaginary figures constantly ordered him to perform dangerous protective rituals. He was forced to fight an utterly exhausting daily battle against a relentless enemy that lived securely behind his own bloodshot eyes. Among this chaotic, suffocating symphony of auditory hallucinations, one specific and dominating frequency gradually overpowered all the other imaginary tormentors. It was a completely distorted, profoundly malevolent manifestation of his own mother, relentlessly screaming at him from the very center of his skull. This phantom version of Osa Gordon systematically eroded his remaining grip on objective reality by subjecting him to unimaginable levels of psychological abuse. The invisible voice deliberately deprived him of sleep for agonizing weeks, while constantly whispering terrifying accusations and apocalyptic threats into his waking consciousness. His internal psychological prison was absolutely inescapable because the cruel warden controlling the locked gates was a fractured projection of his own mother. Every single broken neuron in his deteriorating brain was meticulously paving a dark road toward a singular, highly specific and brutal physical destination. The complete abandonment by his famous peers and the American medical system ensured that this spiraling descent into madness would remain tragically uninterrupted. Here's where it gets interesting, because these debilitating hallucinations were merely the opening act for a much more devastating physical performance. By the early summer of 1983, the sprawling landscape of North Hollywood represented the pinnacle of the middle-class American dream. It was a meticulously manicured neighborhood of single-family homes, geometric green lawns, and low white fences baking under the golden California sun. This quiet suburban grid was designed to be a pristine sanctuary, away from the chaotic darkness of the Los Angeles music industry. Neighbors watered their flower beds on quiet Sunday mornings, completely oblivious to the unimaginable horrors breeding behind closed residential doors. The architecture of these suburban streets promised safety, offering an idyllic illusion that hard work guaranteed a peaceful and secure retirement. It was the kind of perfectly ordinary American street where nothing violently extraordinary was ever supposed to fracture the predictable rhythm of daily life. Living quietly within this sun-drenched suburban fortress was a 72-year-old woman named Osa Marie Gordon, the mother of a fallen generational genius. She was a woman of traditional maternal values, representing an old, simple America that fundamentally did not understand the modern psychiatric vocabulary. Osa had proudly watched her handsome golden boy conquer the towering heights of the international rock and roll industry just a decade earlier. She kept the glowing magazine clippings and platinum records, treating his commercial success as the ultimate validation of her dedicated maternal sacrifice. But as the 1970s crashed into the 1980s, those shiny golden records on the wall slowly transformed into haunting artifacts. The brilliant, soft-spoken drummer she had carefully raised was systematically being replaced by a terrifying stranger who was constantly muttering to unseen enemies. She responded to his terrifying schizophrenic descent, not with clinical psychiatric intervention, but with the boundless patience of a traditional American mother. Whenever Jim showed up at her quiet suburban doorstep unannounced, shivering from paranoid delusions, she would simply welcome him inside and offer him food. She genuinely believed that unconditional maternal love and the quiet comfort of a familiar childhood home could somehow silence the vicious voices in his head. The medical establishment had essentially abandoned him when his studio contracts dried up, leaving this elderly woman as his sole remaining anchor to reality. But here is where it gets interesting. Because that exact maternal devotion was actively being weaponized by the severe chemical imbalances inside his brain. The terrifying auditory hallucinations had begun to specifically target Osa, convincing the severely ill musician that his own mother was the architect of his torment. The pristine suburban sanctuary was slowly suffocating under an invisible heavy blanket of impending doom as the brutal summer heat of 1983 intensified. Osa moved through her impeccably clean kitchen and well-maintained living room with the quiet, unspoken anxiety of a woman walking through an active minefield. She meticulously arranged the furniture and carefully prepared the family meals, desperately trying to maintain the comforting illusion of domestic normalcy amidst absolute psychological chaos. Every single time the telephone rang or a car engine idled slightly too long in the driveway, a sharp spike of pure terror gripped her chest. She was completely isolated in her own comfortable home, trapped in a terrifying dynamic where her deep maternal instincts collided with raw, unpredictable psychosis. The American dream had promised her a peaceful twilight, but it delivered a monstrous, inescapable nightmare wrapped in the tragic shell of her own son. The manicured lawns and the perfectly painted fences of the neighborhood stood completely silent, completely unaware of the demonic tragedy brewing inside the Gordon residence. This house was no longer a place of quiet refuge. It had effectively become a claustrophobic death cell, waiting for the final fatal spark. The old woman continued to blindly trust the boy who had once played those beautiful piano melodies, refusing to lock her doors against his terrifying madness. She believed that a mother's embrace could conquer any darkness, completely underestimating the lethal nature of untreated, violently paranoid schizophrenia in a grown man. That profound, unwavering maternal faith is a genuinely beautiful sentiment that has tragically cost countless innocent people their lives throughout the dark history of the world. It was the ultimate, devastating setup for a violently bloody crescendo that would permanently shatter the quiet illusion of this sun-baked California paradise. The warm California sun climbed slowly over the quiet streets of North Hollywood. It was the 3rd day of June in 1983. The peaceful suburban neighborhood sat trapped in a perfect morning stillness. Sprinklers hissed rhythmically across impeccably manicured green American lawns. Osa Marie Gordon moved quietly inside her remarkably ordinary suburban home. She was a 72-year-old mother who deeply loved her troubled son. She had spent years watching him slip into a terrifying mental abyss. The expensive American mental health care system had completely failed them both. She heard a heavy, deliberate knock at her sturdy wooden front door. She probably expected a desperate son returning home for maternal comfort. She walked slowly toward the entrance of the quiet family house. Her aged hand reached out and turned the cold brass doorknob. Now listen carefully to how the ultimate American nightmare actually unfolds. There was absolutely no emotional reunion waiting on that concrete front porch. There was no desperate son seeking a warm, loving maternal embrace. Jim Gordon stood there with a mind entirely consumed by dark static. The chaotic voices in his head had finally achieved total control. The phantom voice of his mother had explicitly ordered him to kill her. He did not bring flowers or beg for any urgent psychiatric help. He brought a heavy wooden hammer and a sharp butcher knife. The reality of true crime is never cinematic or tragically romantic. It is just sudden, brutal, and horrifyingly senseless in its violent execution. He raised the heavy hammer without saying a single word to her. The first brutal blow struck her with ruthless and terrifying precision. The legendary American drummer used the exact same hands that built rock history. Those platinum hands now delivered fatal blunt force trauma to a fragile skull. She fell violently onto the entryway floor of her own supposedly safe home. The horrifying reality of the situation was entirely stripped of any musical glamour. This was not a misunderstood artist struggling with his internal creative demons. This was a severely schizophrenic man executing a horrific blood-soaked delusion. He swung the hammer multiple times with terrifying and calculated rhythmic force. The meticulously kept suburban house quickly became a gruesome and chaotic slaughterhouse. He then used the butcher knife to finish the macabre, brutal task. The quiet neighborhood remained completely oblivious to the horrific, bloody carnage inside. The rhythmic thudding inside the house finally stopped in the dark hallway. Osa Gordon lay dead on the floor of her beloved family home. The man who wrote the beautiful piano coda for Layla stood over her. He felt absolutely no remorse or immediate guilt for his brutal actions. The domineering voices in his fractured mind suddenly went completely, eerily silent. He casually walked away from the gruesome scene of the violent murder. The idealized American dream of that quiet suburban street was violently ripped apart. He left behind a shattered family and a horrifying pool of red blood. The golden boy of rock music was now a brutal, remorseless killer. The Los Angeles courtroom in the spring of 1984 was completely devoid of the glamorous flashing lights that had previously defined his entire existence. Jim Gordon sat quietly at the heavy wooden defense table, wearing a terrible suit that seemed to completely swallow his rapidly deteriorating physical frame. He was officially facing charges of second-degree murder for the brutal killing of his own mother in her quiet North Hollywood home. The American legal system was now aggressively preparing to process a deeply complicated psychological tragedy through its incredibly rigid and unforgiving bureaucratic machinery. California law at the time relied heavily on a highly controversial standard regarding the insanity defense that essentially ignored severe modern psychiatric realities. The court only wanted to know if the defendant technically understood the fundamental difference between right and wrong at the exact moment of the violent act. Multiple highly respected medical experts provided lengthy testimonies detailing the severe, untreated schizophrenia that had completely ravaged his fragile mind over the preceding decade. The psychiatrist systematically explained how the unrelenting voices had meticulously convinced him that his mother was actually an evil entity actively destroying his life. However, the strict legal statutes fundamentally required an absolute binary answer to a complicated question that existed entirely within the darkest shades of grey. Because he had theoretically attempted to conceal the terrible crime, the prosecuting attorneys successfully argued that he possessed basic level of criminal awareness. The tragic reality of his profound mental illness was systematically reduced to a simple legal technicality by lawyers who were just doing their demanding jobs. The court essentially ruled that a man suffering from severe auditory hallucinations was still perfectly capable of making rational, legally binding moral decisions. The exhausted jury eventually returned a guilty verdict that legally condemned the former musical prodigy to a staggering sentence of 16 years to life behind bars. There was no meaningful public outrage or passionate outcry from the millions of dedicated fans who had previously purchased his platinum-selling studio records. The justice system efficiently functioned exactly as designed, locking away a dangerous individual without ever actually addressing the root cause of the devastating violence. He was quietly transported to a maximum security medical facility where he would spend the remaining decades of his life heavily medicated and completely forgotten by society. The American legal apparatus successfully closed the tragic case file, completely ignoring the massive institutional failures that had directly led to this completely preventable catastrophe. But here is where it gets interesting, because the ultimate betrayal did not actually happen inside that sterile California courtroom. During the agonizingly long trial, the powerful music executives who had previously exploited his extraordinary talents were absolutely nowhere to be found in the spectator gallery. They did not offer to pay for expensive defense attorneys or provide crucial character witnesses to help explain the immense pressures of his former superstar lifestyle. The ruthless entertainment industry had aggressively extracted every single usable beat from his brilliant mind before carelessly tossing his broken shell into the legal garbage disposal. They continued to collect massive royalty checks from his famous drum tracks while he sat in a cold jail cell wearing a standard orange institutional jumpsuit. The very same capitalist machine that had cheerfully ignored his early psychotic breaks was now perfectly silent when the inevitable bloody consequences finally arrived. The heartbreaking tragedy of Jim Gordon is not merely a sensational true crime story about a famous musician who violently lost his mind in the suburbs. It is a terrifying indictment of a fundamentally flawed society that exclusively values human beings based entirely on their ability to generate massive financial profits. The industry tolerated his madness when it produced hit records, but the legal system showed absolutely no mercy when that exact same madness produced a corpse. They ruthlessly squeezed the magical genius out of a severely sick man, repeatedly ignored all the blazing warning signs, and then blamed him for bleeding out. They spent decades actively searching for a violent monster to securely lock away behind steel bars to protect the fragile illusion of the famous American dream. They successfully found their terrifying monster, completely ignoring the dark fact that they had enthusiastically built him themselves inside their very own expensive Hollywood recording studios. 40 years after that horrifying summer morning in North Hollywood, the world still enthusiastically consumes the breathtaking musical legacy that Jim Gordon carefully constructed. Whenever you turn on a classic rock radio station rolling down an American highway, you will inevitably hear that beautiful, melancholic piano coda from Layla. Those incredibly delicate piano keys were originally struck by a man who was desperately trying to silence the terrifying symphony of madness inside his head. We effortlessly separate the timeless art from the deeply flawed artist because it allows us to comfortably enjoy the masterpiece without confronting the underlying tragedy. While millions of oblivious listeners peacefully swayed to his majestic chord progressions, the brilliant architect of that very rhythm was locked inside a psychiatric facility. Jim Gordon ultimately spent the remaining 4 decades of his tragic life staring at institutional walls before quietly passing away behind bars in March 2023. The American music industry had long ago forgotten the discarded, broken genius, completely erasing his profound suffering from the glamorous official history of rock and roll. He was a man who possessed the extraordinary ability to keep perfect time for the entire world, while completely losing his grip on reality. It remains a deeply unsettling paradox that a mind capable of producing such enduring beauty was simultaneously harboring a devastating nightmare that destroyed his family. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is that his musical fingerprints will forever outlive the horrific violence he committed on that fateful Sunday. I have been your narrator exploring the darkest corners of music history, and if you found this compelling, please remember to subscribe for more weekly videos. Thank you so much for watching this documentary, and I will see you again when we uncover another hidden mystery in the next exciting episode.